One evening, a black man walks home only to be stopped by a racist cop. Accused and judged based on his skin color, he's pushed to the edge. But what happens next shocks everyone. This man isn't just anyone. He's a war hero, and his truth will change everything. Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring and thought-provoking videos like this one. Your support helps us share impactful stories that matter. Now, let's get started. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the quiet neighborhood. James, a tall black man in his mid-30s, walked down the street, his footsteps slow but steady. The day had been long, and his body ached from hours of hard work. He wore a simple white shirt and dark jeans, the edges of his sleeves slightly rolled up from the heat. His bag hung loosely over his shoulder, its contents, a few papers and lunch leftovers, almost forgotten as he let his mind drift. The neighborhood was peaceful, lined with modest homes, trees casting long shadows across driveways, and the occasional dog barking in the distance. James knew this street well, having walked it every day for the past 3 years. The familiar sound of crickets chirping and the occasional car passing by had always made this place feel like home. But today, something felt off. As James neared the corner of the block, the familiar hum of a car engine grew louder. He glanced over his shoulder to see a cop car slowing down behind him. The flashing lights blinked in a rhythmic pattern, but there was no siren. The car pulled over to the side of the street, stopping just a few feet ahead of James. His heart rate picked up a little, but he kept walking, trying to appear unaffected. It was probably nothing. Maybe the officer was just waiting for someone. But then the door of the cop car swung open, and Officer Thompson stepped out. James had seen him around before, tall, broad-shouldered, with a hard face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. Thompson wasn't one to engage in friendly conversations with the people in the neighborhood. He had always kept his distance, like most cops in this part of town. But today, something felt different. "Hey!" Officer Thompson's voice cut through the quiet evening air, sharp and commanding. James stopped and turned toward the officer, instinctively tensing his shoulders. "Yes, officer?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "What are you doing around here?" Officer Thompson demanded, his eyes scanning James up and down. There was something in his gaze, an unmistakable suspicion. James blinked, confused. "I'm just heading home, officer." The cop took a step forward, his expression hardening. "You don't belong here," he said, his tone dripping with judgment. "You don't live around here, do you?" The words hung in the air, thick with an accusation James couldn't quite place. His mind raced. He had lived on this street for 3 years now, paid his rent on time, never caused any trouble. But none of that seemed to matter in the eyes of the officer standing before him. It was as if James was guilty by default, simply because of the color of his skin. James took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I live just down the block," he said, his voice steady. "I've lived here for years now." But Officer Thompson wasn't listening. He took another step closer, his face narrowing. "I don't trust you," he muttered, barely audible. "I've seen you around, and I know what kind of people walk through here." The tension in the air was palpable. James could feel his heart beating louder now, the weight of the officer's gaze pressing down on him. He had no idea where this was going, but he knew this moment would not end well if he didn't choose his next words carefully. The officer's stance was aggressive, but James stood his ground, trying to keep his composure. He could feel the eyes of the neighbors on him, peering through their windows, some already pulling out their phones to record. But this wasn't just another random stop. This felt personal. It felt like judgment before he even had the chance to explain. And as James stood there holding his breath, the only thing he could think was, why? James stood there, the weight of Officer Thompson's words sinking in, like stones being dropped into a deep well. His breath quickened, but he fought to keep his voice steady. The man who had served his country, the man who had lived his life without ever causing harm to anyone, now found himself on the receiving end of a harsh accusation that made no sense. "What's the problem, officer?" James asked, his voice calm but edged with confusion. He kept his posture straight, his hands by his sides. He didn't want to show fear, but the way the officer was looking at him made him feel like he was being suffocated. Thompson's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. He took another step forward, his boots scraping against the pavement. "I've seen you here before," he said, his voice rising. "You're up to no good. Don't think I don't know what's going on around here." James blinked. Up to no good? He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His mind raced, scrambling to make sense of the situation. What does that even mean? He had been walking this same route every day for months. He'd passed by this very officer dozens of times, and nothing had ever been said. So why now? Why this accusation? "I don't know what you mean, officer," James said, his tone still measured, though his pulse was beginning to race. He felt like he was walking a fine line between standing his ground and doing whatever it took to avoid escalating the situation. He wasn't sure how much more of this he could take before it spiraled out of control. Thompson, however, seemed to be growing more impatient. "I know your kind," he spat, his eyes flashing with something dangerous. "You think you can just walk through here like you belong, like you have a right to be in my neighborhood?" The words hit James like a slap in the face, but he didn't flinch. My neighborhood? James had lived here for years. He paid his rent, worked hard every day, and never once caused any trouble. But to the officer, it didn't matter. To Thompson, James was just another face in the crowd, a face that didn't fit the picture he had of who should belong where. "Sir," James began, his voice tinged with frustration now, "I live here. I'm just walking home. That's all. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's lip curled in a sneer. "Oh, I know you think that," he said with disdain. "But I've seen the way you guys—" He stopped himself, but it was clear what he was about to say. It was something James had heard countless times before. "You think you can just blend in, but we know who you really are, and I won't stand for it." A chill ran down James's spine. He had heard it all. He had lived through the subtle looks, the whispered comments, the stares. But this? This was different. This wasn't just casual racism or judgment. This was a direct attack on his very existence, his right to walk down a street that he called home. The officer took another step closer. James could feel the heat of the man's body now, the tension between them palpable. James clenched his fists at his sides, doing his best to control his anger. He could feel it rising inside him, bubbling beneath the surface. But he knew that if he let it out, if he let his emotions take over, things could spiral beyond repair. "I don't know what you're trying to prove here, officer," James said, his voice low but firm. "But I've done nothing wrong. I'm not some criminal, and I'm certainly not someone you need to be worried about." Thompson's eyes flickered with something dark, something dangerous. "Oh, I'm not worried about you. Not really. But you don't get to walk through here like you own the place. You don't get to ignore what's going on around you." James swallowed hard, the weight of the officer's words pressing down on him. The crowd of bystanders that had started to gather in the background seemed to watch in silence, their eyes shifting between James and the officer. Some of them pulled out their phones, likely to record the encounter, but no one stepped forward. No one intervened. James could feel the eyes on him, the judgment in the air, and suddenly it hit him. This wasn't just about him. This wasn't just about one man being wrongly accused. This was about something much bigger. The systemic racism that existed, the biases that people like Officer Thompson carried without even realizing it. James had experienced it his whole life. The looks, the comments, the subtle ways people made him feel like he didn't belong. And now it was all coming to a head in this single, momentous encounter. "I'm not some other," James said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. "I'm not some threat you can just label. I'm a man, just like you." Thompson's lip curled into a mockery of a smile. "You think you're the same as me? You think I'm supposed to treat you the same way I'd treat anyone else?" He laughed, a cold, harsh sound. "You're nothing like me." James felt a surge of anger at that. He wanted to shout, to scream at the officer. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through." But he knew that wouldn't help. He needed to stay calm. He needed to show that he was better than the hate being thrown his way. "You don't know me," James said quietly, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know anything about my life. You don't know what I've done, what I've sacrificed, or who I really am. But you judge me anyway." For a moment, Officer Thompson seemed to hesitate. The anger in his face faltered, just for a split second, before it returned with full force. "I know enough," Thompson said, his voice low and threatening, "and that's all that matters." The air between them grew heavier, the tension thick and suffocating. James stood tall, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the weight of the moment, the strange sense that everything was riding on this single conversation. The eyes of the onlookers were on him, their attention split between him and the officer. The street felt like a battlefield, with James caught in the middle of a war he never asked for, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The standoff between James and Officer Thompson hung in the air, thick with tension. The officer's eyes were narrowed, his posture stiff and aggressive. James could feel the anger radiating from the man, like a heat he couldn't escape. His own chest tightened with the pressure of the moment. He could see the officer's hand inching closer to his belt, ready to draw his weapon. A shiver ran down James's spine, but he refused to let fear take hold. "I'm not the one he thinks I am," he told himself. For a fleeting second, James thought about running, about ducking down an alley and disappearing from sight. But he knew that wouldn't solve anything. This wasn't just about him. It was bigger than that. So he stood his ground, the weight of everything he had endured pushing him to make a stand. He could see it in Officer Thompson's eyes, the tension, the readiness to escalate. The moment hung on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one slip, and this could go from a verbal confrontation to something much worse. In an attempt to break the silence, James slowly, deliberately reached into his bag. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, tracking every movement, every second that passed like a countdown to something inevitable. The officer's fingers twitched, hovering near his gun. James knew it wouldn't take much to provoke him further. "Don't panic. Just stay calm. Show him who you are, not who he thinks you are." James took a deep breath and pulled out a small, worn-out leather wallet. His fingers trembled slightly, but he forced them to steady. The world seemed to freeze around him as he opened the wallet and slowly, almost reverently, pulled out his military ID. The edges were frayed, the once shiny photo faded with age, but the ID was still there, proof of who he was, of what he had done, of everything he had given for this country. The officer's gaze flickered to the ID, then back to James. For a moment, everything went quiet. The voices in the background, the murmurs of bystanders, the distant sounds of cars on the street. It all seemed to disappear. James could feel the weight of the officer's stare, but he didn't look away. "I'm not the one you think I am," James said, his voice low but unwavering. He let the words hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Thompson's eyes narrowed, the confusion on his face more apparent now than before. He didn't speak. He simply watched James, trying to process the shift in the situation. James's voice grew stronger as he continued, his words coming out more forcefully now. "I served. I fought in the war." His hand shook slightly as he held the ID up, the image of a younger version of himself, tired but proud, staring back at him. "I didn't deserve this then, And I don't deserve it now. The officer's posture faltered, just for a moment. It was as if the weight of those words hit him like a punch to the gut. Thompson's fingers hovered over his gun, then slowly, almost involuntarily, moved away. The officer's hand dropped to his side, and the harsh lines of his face softened, though not entirely. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He didn't speak. James didn't let the moment pass. He took a step forward, keeping his voice steady but firm. I fought for this country, for your freedom, and this is how I'm treated. He paused for a beat, letting the words sink in. His chest tightened with emotion, but he pushed through it. Every day, because of the color of my skin? The question lingered in the air between them, more piercing than any accusation James could have made. The words seemed to reverberate, the truth of them undeniable. Thompson stood frozen, caught between the weight of what James had said and the reality of the situation. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them felt like it had stopped, and it was just the two of them in the street, two men from different worlds, each caught in a battle they hadn't chosen. James could see the officer's mind working, his jaw tightening, his hands flexing at his sides. Thompson's eyes darted between the ID and James's face, his brows furrowing deeper as he tried to make sense of what was happening. There was confusion there, but also something else, something closer to shame or perhaps guilt. James took another step closer. I've seen it all, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. The looks, the whispers, the way you treat me like I'm less than human. His hands balled into fists at his sides, but he didn't raise them. I put my life on the line, and yet every time I walk down the street, I'm looked at like I'm a criminal. The officer didn't move. His eyes were fixed on James, but it was hard to tell what he was thinking. James knew that the officer had probably never seen things from his perspective. He had probably never had to fight for his rights, never had to fear for his life simply because of the color of his skin. But that didn't make it right. I'm just a man, officer, James said, his voice breaking slightly now. Just a man who has fought for his country, for his right to be here. And yet you look at me like I'm less than nothing. The officer's mouth opened as if he wanted to say something, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. His gaze dropped to the ground for a moment, and for a second it seemed like he was searching for the right words, or perhaps any words at all. But none came. James didn't look away. He wasn't going to give up now, not when the truth was so clear. I've fought for this country, he repeated, his voice unwavering. But what I don't understand is why I'm still fighting for my right to exist here. For the first time, Thompson's expression faltered. It wasn't just confusion anymore. It was something deeper, something closer to recognition. But James wasn't sure if that recognition would lead to change. Not yet. The officer finally spoke, his voice quieter now, almost reluctant. I didn't know. His words felt like an apology, but they didn't quite reach James's heart. They weren't enough. Not after everything. James didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was already out in the open, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had said everything that needed to be said. The air between them felt different now, tense, but fragile. James wasn't sure if things would ever be the same, if the officer would ever fully understand. But in that moment, he had said his piece, and in a strange way, that felt like a victory. Officer Thompson stood frozen, his eyes locked on the military ID James had just handed him. The harsh, accusing expression that had once painted his face began to falter, his gaze drifting between the worn-out photo and the name stamped in bold, faded letters. For a moment, everything around them seemed to disappear. The murmurs from the bystanders, the distant hum of traffic, the weight of the evening air. It was as if time had stopped. James's words still hung between them, thick and undeniable. "I fought for this country, for your freedom, and this is how I'm treated." Thompson's breath hitched, and his hand, which had been hovering near his holster just moments before, now remained still at his side. His fingers twitched as he continued to stare at the ID, a soldier's ID, a reminder of the man standing before him. Not a criminal, not an outsider, but someone who had served this very nation with his blood, sweat, and tears. James's face remained calm, but there was a subtle tremor in his voice that wasn't there before. As Thompson absorbed the gravity of the situation, he realized that he had misjudged this man, and for reasons he couldn't yet fully understand, that mistake cut deeper than any weapon he had ever carried. James shifted his weight from one foot to the other, waiting for a response that wasn't coming. Officer Thompson's mouth was slightly open, as if words were attempting to form but couldn't quite break free. It wasn't just the shock of the ID that had him rooted to the spot. It was the realization that the man he had been ready to confront, the man he had reduced to an other, was someone he should have respected, not feared. The officer's mind raced, but the confusion was evident. He had been so sure of his assumptions, so convinced of his place in this situation. It had been easier that way, just to see James as a stranger, a threat, an outsider in a neighborhood that he felt needed to be protected from people like him. But now, as he stared at the faded military ID and remembered the words James had said, "I fought for this country, for your freedom," Thompson felt his own certainty begin to crumble. He swallowed, trying to find his voice, but nothing came. He opened his mouth, but only silence filled the space. James took a small, slow step forward, his eyes still fixed on the officer, but his tone gentler now, quieter, almost broken. "I'm just trying to live like everyone else," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to tremble in the air between them. But it's harder when the world sees you as less than human. The officer's gaze flickered up from the ID to James's face, and for the first time, he saw it. Really saw it. The exhaustion in James's eyes. The quiet, invisible weight he carried every day. The weight of a world that refused to see him as an equal. A man with rights. A man deserving of respect. James wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't just a man walking down the street. He was someone who had been fighting every single day of his life, not for freedom in some faraway country, but for the very freedom to exist in his own skin, to be seen as a human being without prejudice. James's words pierced through the shield that Thompson had built around himself, and the officer felt the prick of shame creep into his chest. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing people as individuals. Somewhere, in the routine of his job, he had started to group people into categories, making snap judgments based on race, on appearance. He had let his own biases, his own assumptions, cloud his ability to truly see the person in front of him. James's words had shattered that illusion. The anger, the frustration, the years of pent-up pain, he saw it now, not as an enemy, not as a threat, but as a reflection of his own ignorance. Officer Thompson stood there, still silent, his breath shallow. He couldn't find the words to apologize. He couldn't find the words to make this right, because no words could undo the years of judgment, the years of unfairness, the years of systemic racism that both men had lived through, one as a victim and the other as a perpetrator. James didn't look for an apology. He wasn't asking for one. He wasn't even sure if Thompson was capable of understanding what he had done to him. But he wasn't going to wait around for the officer's comprehension to come to fruition. He had said what needed to be said. He had spoken the truth that Thompson now had to confront. With one last look, James slowly began to turn, his steps measured but purposeful. There was no rush in his movement, no hurry to leave, but he knew this was the moment. The moment where he could finally walk away from the anger, from the pain, from the confusion, and just go home. The officer remained frozen in place, his hands at his sides, his eyes following James's every move. Thompson's chest tightened as he watched the man walk away, his footsteps steady but heavy with the burden of truth. James didn't look back, didn't pause to see if Thompson would say anything. He didn't need to hear any more empty apologies. All he needed was to get home, to find peace, if only for a moment in the place that was supposed to be his sanctuary. As James walked away, Officer Thompson stood there, a man undone, his mind reeling. He could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him, could feel it in every muscle of his body. The realization was raw, almost painful. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to ask for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. He had spent so long carrying this image of the world in his mind, this us versus them mentality, where people like James were enemies to be watched, to be controlled. He had believed, deep down, that he was doing his job, that he was protecting something. But now, in the wake of James's quiet dignity, in the aftermath of the truth James had spoken, Thompson couldn't deny that what he had been doing wasn't protection, it was oppression. For the first time, he realized how wrong he had been, and the weight of that realization crushed him. James had walked away. The crowd of bystanders murmured among themselves, still recording, still watching. But to Officer Thompson, none of that mattered anymore. He had no idea how he could make this right. He had no idea if he could ever be forgiven for what he had done. But he knew one thing for sure. He would never see the world the same way again. James walked slowly down the street, his steps steady but heavy. Each footfall seemed to echo in the quiet of the evening. The weight of his past and present pressed on him, but he walked with the quiet dignity that had been forced upon him over years of struggling for recognition, for respect. Every day had been a battle, not just for survival, but for the chance to live freely in a world that too often tried to strip him of his humanity. The camera lingered on James's back as he walked farther away, the fading light casting long shadows on the pavement. His figure grew smaller, more distant, until he was nothing but a silhouette against the horizon. It was a slow, deliberate retreat, one that didn't come from fear, but from the recognition that sometimes walking away was the most powerful thing you could do. In that moment, it wasn't just the end of a confrontation. It was the end of something bigger. It was the end of a life spent in the shadows, under the weight of unearned suspicion. But it was also the beginning of something else, something James couldn't fully grasp yet. Perhaps something as simple as the quiet hope that things might someday be different. As he disappeared from view, the camera turned back to Officer Thompson, still standing at the same spot. His eyes were vacant, lost in thought, as though the words James had spoken had planted a seed that was now growing, unraveling the tangled knots of his beliefs, of everything he had assumed about the world. The officer's chest rose and fell slowly as he tried to process what had just happened, the overwhelming guilt, the disbelief, the raw honesty of what he had been forced to face. The conversation replayed in his mind, each word echoing louder than the last. James's voice had carried with it not just the pain of a man wronged, but the deep, unspoken truth of generations of suffering, of systemic injustice, of a world that had made him feel like less than a man. I'm just trying to live like everyone else. But it's harder when the world sees you as less than human. The words rang out in Thompson's ears, unrelenting. He had heard them, but they weren't just words anymore. They were a truth that cut through the armor of his indifference, his assumptions, his easy judgments. It was the kind of truth that made him question everything he thought he knew. He couldn't explain it, not yet. Maybe he wouldn't ever be able to. But he knew in that moment that something had shifted inside him. Something had changed, not because he was a better person, but because the world had been made a little clearer. His eyes were open now, in a way they hadn't been before, and that terrified him as much as it enlightened him. The officer stood motionless, as though he couldn't move, couldn't leave just yet. For a long time, there was no sound but the soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. His mind was a jumble of conflicting thoughts: his job, his duty, his responsibility, and the painful awareness that he had failed, not just James, but everyone who had ever been looked at with suspicion, with hatred, for something as arbitrary as the color of their skin. Finally, he shifted, the weight of his thoughts bearing down on him. With a slow, deliberate motion, Officer Thompson turned away from the street where James had walked and began to make his way back toward his car. His steps were slow, measured, almost as if he were moving in a dream, unable to fully wake from it. The patrol car loomed in front of him, its cold metal a stark contrast to the heat of the emotions now flooding his chest. Thompson opened the door with mechanical precision, sliding into the seat as though it was the most natural thing in the world. But even as he sat there, hands gripping the wheel, he couldn't escape the truth of what had just happened. His eyes moved over the dashboard, but they weren't really seeing it. He wasn't focused on the keys, the radio, or the siren. His mind was elsewhere, caught in a memory of the past few minutes. He thought of the weight of James's gaze, the quiet strength in his voice, and he thought about the shame he felt. Shame not just for what had happened, but for how long he had been blind to the world around him. As the car engine hummed to life, Thompson's fingers tightened around the wheel. But the movement was absent, distant. His mind was elsewhere, still trapped in the conversation he had just had. "I fought for this country, for your freedom." How many times had he heard those words but never really heard them? How many times had he seen men and women like James, only to reduce them to stereotypes, to judgments based on appearances? How many times had he turned a blind eye to the humanity that sat right in front of him? He hadn't been able to answer James then, couldn't even come close. He didn't know what to say now, but what struck him most was how much he needed to change. The world was more complicated than he had ever allowed himself to see, and for the first time, he was afraid of what he might find as he peeled back the layers of his own biases. The camera lingered on Officer Thompson as he sat in the car, the stillness around him now almost suffocating. The sound of his breath was the only thing that broke the silence. For a long while, he remained there, lost in thought, unable to move, unable to fully reconcile the man he had been with the man he knew he had to become. And then, almost imperceptibly, the camera pulled back, offering a final glimpse of the officer sitting alone in his patrol car, a man caught between two worlds. The scene slowly fades, the camera rising above the street, capturing the empty space where the two men had stood just moments before. The sky was still painted with the hues of sunset, the city pulsing with life, but now it felt quieter, as if something deep had shifted in the air. A message appeared on the screen. "Sometimes it takes just one moment to make you see the world differently." It was a simple truth, but powerful. In that single moment, both James and Officer Thompson had been forced to confront the world as it truly was. They had been forced to see each other, to hear each other, and to acknowledge the humanity they shared, despite the walls that had divided them for so long. And though the story had come to a close, the journey for both men was far from over. Because sometimes it takes just one moment, not to solve everything, but to begin the real work of change.